because there's always a plethora of things we should be thankful for. We ask that you be with us tonight, and may you be glorified in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So we're in part 15. We're really going to be looking at a man by the name of Eusebius and some theology that was going on during the time. That's him, fine-looking fellow with a big, majestic beard. I won't harp on that again, but you know. He was born in 260 A.D., so I got to apologize. Just when y'all thought we were advancing down the timeline of history, we're going to have to rewind a little bit back to the 3rd century, even though we spent the last few weeks in the 4th. We have to do it this way so things make sense as we continue our study. So he was born in Palestine in 260 A.D. He is known by Eusebius of Caesarea because that is where he spent most of his life and also where he served as bishop. He was one of those kind of brilliant minds, the kind of guy that could read something one time and remember it forever. Y'all know anybody like that? Are you one of those people like that? I've known a few in my life, and it's amazing that a guy can hear something or read something one time and it's just there. It's not going anywhere. Unfortunately, I have to read something 47 times before I finally get it. But he wasn't that way. You know, he was brilliant. During his time, there was no one who is more well-learned on Christianity, especially the history of Christianity. I know this is only the 3rd century, but there was no one more well-learned than he was. We don't really know how he was, what led to his conversion. I mean, obviously the big thing is God saved him. But we don't know if he was raised in a Christian home or if he was converted later in life. But we do know that he loved Constantine. Here's a quote, actually, of him that's kind of cringy, but he did say it. This is just to show what he felt about Constantine. Looking westward or eastward, looking over the whole earth, even looking at heaven, always and everywhere, I see blessed Constantine leading the empire. I know, that's pretty cringy and probably borderline blasphemous, but he was talking in a different time, and by the way, it wasn't in English. So, you know, we got to give him a little grace there, different time. All that to say, he admired Constantine very much, maybe too much. A lot of people, because of his love for Constantine, assumed him to be sort of this spineless man that was obsessed with the imperial Roman world. But when you look at his entire career, yes, he has a love for Constantine, but he was much more than that. All right, so we do not know where Eusebius came to faith or how. We do know that one man God used mightily in his life, and his name is Pamphilus. Pamphilus, I'm not sure. He's got a pretty good beard too. Just so you fellas, just pay attention. That's all I'm saying. He was a native of Berytus, which is now, if you guess this one, Nancy, you get a gold star. I put you on the spot. It is now Beirut in Lebanon. So this is where this man grew up. He was a native there. He studied in Alexandria, and we know that during that time, Alexandria was the place for higher learning. Not just Christian higher learning, but higher education in general, especially philosophy. He studied under the teachings of a man named Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was a popular teacher, and he was mostly known for carrying on with Origen's work there in Alexandria. Pamphilus held some important positions there in the town. Then he ended up going to Caesarea under the request of the bishop of that city. I know, just stick with me. The church in Caesarea kept Origen's entire library. And Pamphilus spent a lot of time working and organizing it. That was kind of his main gig, to just maintain and keep organized Origen's library. Of course, he had a team around him that helped him, and they were always intrigued by his intelligence and how he was a man of strong faith. He was a man they looked up to. One of those young men that was helping him was, going back to, Eusebius. Matter of fact, Eusebius would later call himself Eusebius of Pamphilus. So he loved this man a lot as well. So these two, along with several others, spent years working as a team. They even lived in the same small room, and they pretty much shared everything. All their money, all their resources, all their food. This is what they gave their lives for. Eventually, however, the student, Eusebius, passed his teacher, and he would end up traveling in search of any resources he could get his hands on regarding the origins of Christianity. But during their time together, they wrote several books together. Unfortunately, most of them have been lost. And so again, we're kind of back into the 3rd century. So I want to remind you, though we have been speaking much of how persecution has ended the last few weeks, that's the 4th century. Because we're rewinding a bit, we have to remember that during this time, severe persecution is going on. Pamphilus would end up being sent to prison, and after spending 2 years in prison, he would be executed. Several of their companions faced martyrdom as well, but God chose to spare Eusebius. In spite of this severe persecution, he worked on his most important contribution that he ever did, was his work on church history. You can get it in modern English now, but this is really the first few centuries of the church's history. This would serve, and still does serve, as a valuable resource for historians. As a matter of fact, without this work right here, most of what we have covered so far we would not have known. That's how much Eusebius' contributions is still affecting the world today. I'm not using this work, but the work I'm using to outline these studies is heavily using this work. You picking up what I'm throwing down? All right. It was Eusebius who researched, gathered information, collected it all, and published pretty much everything we know about the first few centuries of the Christian church. And again, we've already covered what happened in 311 AD when Galerius issued an edict about Christianity now being tolerated. And then later Constantine would defeat Maxentius, and eventually persecution would flat out end. According to Eusebius and his companions, what was taking place was divine intervention. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, surely. But they said this was on the same scale as God leading the Israelites out of Egypt. So they put what was going on with Constantine, they compared that to what went on with Moses and the Exodus. Again, is God providentially and sovereignly in control of all those things? Yeah, he absolutely is. But again, this was a big deal for them. From that point on, the men started looking at Constantine and Licinius as instruments being used of God to bring about Christian peace and advancement. But if you remember, Constantine and Licinius started looking crossways at one another. Remember? Their brother-in-laws. Constantine's like, hey, he's going to want some of my land, or Licinius, he's going to want to take over all my land. Anyway, they had their disagreements. Eventually, Constantine becomes the sole emperor. And when that happened, Eusebius was elected as bishop of Caesarea. And so, also when that happened, people wrote off Licinius, and they saw Eusebius as the sole God-called Savior of Christianity and the Roman Empire. Not only was he the bishop of the church in Caesarea, he had jurisdiction over the rest of Palestine as well. I always have to force myself to say Palestine because we have a Palestine right down the road. I remember when Zeb first came here, he kept calling Palestine, Palestine. I had to correct him. Like, come on, just get your life together, Zeb. Anyway. After serving as bishop for several years, persecution was over, but a new storm was brewing. Serious theological debates were now threatening to harm the church. And listen, the impatient side of me really just wants to skip ahead to all that and to just plow past this. But setting this stuff up for a few weeks, it'll help everything make more sense then. But in particular, the main theological debate that was threatening to really rip apart the church, again, was the Arian controversy over the divinity of Christ. And I know I've mentioned that several times, but we're going to spend a whole night discussing Arianism in a few weeks. When the controversy first arose, though, Eusebius seemed inclined towards Arianism. Not good. But later, at the Council of Nicaea, when they condemned Arianism, he changed his mind. But then, when the council ended, he changed his mind again. It's sad for me to say, but it appears that at best, Eusebius toed the line of Arianism. And at worst, he was a full-blown Arian. Which would call his conversion into question. Why is that? Well, again, we're going to discuss this more in a few weeks. But Arianism flat out rejects the deity of Christ. So that Jesus is not eternal. He is not God. There was a time when he did not exist. And that's not the Jesus of the Bible, is it? The Jesus of the Bible is clearly God. He is clearly eternal. He has always been. There never was a time that Jesus was not. So that's what was coming into the church and threatening to really rip it apart because many people were buying into it. Yeah, it's the same Arian. Yeah. And so, again, I don't want to jump ahead. I'll just say this. I'll name them in a few weeks. But there are modern forms of Arianism right now. Several modern forms of Arianism. And some of them gather right here in Athens, Texas. So we'll talk about that in a few weeks. But it's a problem. A major problem. Again, let's see where we are here. Again, as I've said many times, being a faithful Christian does not require you to have perfect theology, because no one does have perfect theology. But we better know and believe in the deity of Jesus. There are some things regarding the Christian faith that are not negotiable. We can disagree on some things. You know? We can disagree on when we think Jesus is coming back and still have fellowship. We can disagree with whether we should have instruments in worship or not and still have fellowship. That stuff happens. But Christians cannot disagree on who Jesus is. We can't disagree on the virgin birth. We can't disagree that Jesus physically rose from the dead. Those are the core tenets of the Christian faith, and if you reject those, you reject the faith. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. But if we look at the life of Eusebius, again, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and just say he was kind of trying to toe the line here. Because it's clear that he was the kind of guy that wanted everybody to just get along. And listen, is that a desire that we should have? Should we have a desire that everybody should just get along? Absolutely. But should that desire for everybody to get along keep us from correcting or telling the truth? Absolutely not. Unity is a great thing. We should be unified, but that unity must be based on truth, not by omitting the truth. Picking up what I'm throwing down? But Eusebius was a guy that was willing to just kind of turn the other way, just to ignore something in the hopes that everybody would just continue getting along. So, for example, if he was talking to an Arian, he would lean more that way. If he was talking to one who held to the deity of Christ, he would kind of lean that way. Between this and a speech he gave praising Constantine is why many accuse him of not having a backbone. Again, that might be a little much because he has contributed much. I will say, though he and Constantine had a lot of correspondence back and forth, it was very short. It was very brief. Eusebius was busy in Caesarea with being a bishop and all the ecclesiastical duties that come with that, and Constantine was busy in Constantinople running or dealing with imperial affairs. And it was after the death of Constantine when Eusebius really praised him for being God's instrument to bring peace to the church. His understanding of what had taken place would influence all of his work, especially that book on church history that I showed you a while ago. Earlier Christian writers declared that all truth comes from the same Logos, who is the incarnate Word, Jesus Christ. They also claimed that all the Hebrew Scriptures and some philosophies were given as preparation for the gospel. It is also widely believed that the empire had the peace it brought throughout the Mediterranean basin was ordained by God to spread the gospel message. So, that was a terrible transition. Let me catch you up on where we are. Persecution has ended. Constantine is dead, but his imperial edicts have swept over the land. It's easy life for a Christian now. You have Orthodox Christians, and you have Arians who are rejecting the deity of Jesus, and in between them you have the Jews trying to figure out what to do with all of it. Not to mention the Roman Empire, always in control of pretty much everyday life. So they had to attempt to begin developing an official theology for the church. A statement of faith, if you will. And I know people are flippant about statements of faith, but they serve a tremendous purpose. We need to know, and we need to be able to define what we believe and why we believe it. Because if we, for instance, when it comes to Arianism, let's just say, oh, we don't need to worry about statements of faith. We just need to focus on Jesus. Okay. Are you talking about the Jesus that Arius has popularized? Or are you talking about the Jesus of the Bible? Because those are two different people. And what our statements of faith do is they define what we mean when we use names like Jesus, or terms like church, or baptism, or the Lord's Supper. So that's why developing an official theology is important. That's why it's important that we have a statement of faith and that you know what our statement of faith is. That's why I spent however many weeks it was on Wednesday nights going through our confession of faith. That's why when we have a new members meeting, I make sure everybody knows what our statement of faith is, and I give out a little pamphlet to everyone. Most of them, they're coming from other Baptist churches, so they know what it is anyway. But we need to know that. We need to be familiar with what we believe. But so while all this is going on, church history is being shaped. One example of this is this new age had dawned, and the gospel was seen as something, used to be seen as something for those that were poor, the meek, the weary and heavy laden, right? That's what the gospel is for. Now, riches and land and homes and buildings and all this other stuff was seen as a sign that you have been blessed by God. So now, the litmus test for sincere Christianity was not necessarily what you believed, it was what you had. And that's not good. As a matter of fact, the Bible clearly teaches on the dangers of being wealthy and storing up treasure on earth. Again, it's not that being blessed financially is inherently sinful. It's that it is very dangerous to be wealthy, because that can be where your heart is if you're not careful. Understand? Another idea that was growing in popularity was the idea over the full reign of God. Many were attempting to separate this physical world from the rest of God's domain. So they would say things like, God is ruler of the heavens, but right now He's not ruler of earth. We'll worry about that later when Jesus comes back. Well, what this led them to doing is not living lives of service to Christ. They tried to separate this world from the eternal. And so, again, I was speaking to a brother yesterday on the phone, and he used the phrase nominal Christian. Have y'all heard that before? I don't particularly like that phrase, because the Bible doesn't really add any adjectives in front of the word Christian. You either are or you're not. But what we were talking about is this idea that so many people profess to be Christians, but at the end of the day, they really have no fruit of that being the truth. And that passage I read to you earlier, Matthew 7, if you keep on reading through that, it says you will know a tree by its fruit. Again, so what we have now is people thinking that a sign that you've been blessed by God is not your faith, it's not your commitment, it's not your service to God, it's how much stuff do you have. And then trying to separate this world from God's full reign required or ended up with them believing they didn't really have to serve God in this life. They would have time for that in eternity. So all this stuff would eventually lead to the monastic movement, as we introduced a few weeks ago, where people would purposely flee the pleasures of the easy life to go out and live in the desert where you didn't have all the luxuries at your disposal, where you would have to be more dependent upon God. Again, monasticism has its problems too. For one, it's not very evangelistic, is it? If you isolate yourself from the rest of the world, then you're really not obeying Christ's Great Commission. You're not actively loving your neighbor if you just run away from all of them, right? And I get the draw to be a recluse, right? I get the draw to just, hey man, find a little neck in the mountain somewhere, put your little cabin up, and just live out the rest of your days. I get that. But, hey, you know what? Eternity's at stake. I don't know how many years I'm going to have, but what's the average life expectancy for a man these days? 70-something? 104? I hope not. Let's say 75. I don't know how accurate that is. But man, 75 years is not very much when you're thinking in light of eternity. What am I going to do? I'm going to retire and go live 7 to 8 years in the woods somewhere? I mean, I feel like I'd have to answer for that. Right? Well, I gave God, I stand before God. See, I blessed you with ministry. you had so many years in ministry, and then you were even one of the few that were blessed to be able to retire and just spend time with your wife or grandkids, whatever. And what did you choose to do? You chose to remove yourself from your neighbor. Go live by yourself. You know, that's not, I don't think that's God's design. How about you guys? I'm reminded of a John Piper sermon. I've shared this with you before. If you've never listened to this sermon, listen, I don't agree with everything John Piper says, but he has some tremendous insights and some tremendous messages. But this particular one, he was talking about a couple that was able to retire early, maybe even in their 50s. And he read it in a Reader's Digest while he was at the doctor's office. Read about this story. This particular couple spent their years of retirement traveling around the world, or at least the United States, collecting seashells. Okay? And then he said, I couldn't help but think, one day they're going to be standing before God, and He is the one who has blessed them with everything they've ever had, and He's going to be like, how did you use your time? And they're going to be like, here it is, Lord, my shell collection. That's what happens when we stop thinking in light of eternity and just try to focus on the here and now. Got it? That's what these guys were doing. They were now living an easy life. They didn't really have to suffer for anything. They didn't really want for anything. And this is a long time ago. This is 1,700 years ago. They still had a pretty easy life, though. And it caused them to stop focusing on heaven and eternity and God's gospel advancing over the earth. I just wanted to live their best life now, as one preacher down south has popularized, unfortunately. By the way, if you're living your best life now, what's that say for you as far as eternity goes? Hey, if this is the best, well, then we're in trouble. I've never understood the title of that book. Whatever. So, all this stuff would eventually lead to the monastic movement, and we're going to be looking at that next week. But I want to end this section by stating that everything that Eusebius wrote about was simply coming from not just him, but from the common feelings among most Christians. Sure, he had his own beliefs, but mostly he was recording history as it was playing out. While many were happy wallowing in their peace and abundance, not all Christians felt that way, as we'll be seeing in the next few lessons. All right. Any questions about anything we covered tonight? It's a little shorter tonight. The main thing really to take away from tonight is much of what we have learned so far in these several weeks of church history came from the pen of Eusebius. He was not a perfect man. He may not even been converted. But God used him. All right. Last week y'all had all the questions. And I got a feeling when we get into monasticism and Arianism, you'll have more questions. It's true. Was it the beard? You don't like it? Constantine? Yeah. All right. Well, then we'll begin our prayer meeting, guys, and I'll turn it over to you.